You call this service? Ethan Whitman's voice cut through the morning buzz like a sharp bell, bouncing off the polished countertops and the chrome fixtures, making every customer in the cafe glance up and every employee freeze mid-step, coffee cups trembling in hands, steam from the espresso machine curling in the air like smoke from a quiet fire. At the center, Aaliyah Thompson, the black waitress with a perfectly composed stance, paused for a heartbeat, tray balanced in her hands, her eyes scanning the glaringly expensive chandelier above and the subtle reflections of sunlight hitting the glass windows, noting how the light caught the tiny scratches in the counter where she had polished earlier, each detail familiar to her from countless shifts, each scent of brewed coffee grounding her, each small creak of the hardwood floor under her shoes syncing with her heartbeat, steady, measured, ready, knowing she held a truth that could shift the energy in this room. Ethan's gaze swept past her, sharp, calculating, dismissive, dressed in a tailored navy suit that reflected both authority and the pride of years running his company. And yet his eyes briefly flickered toward the corners of the cafe where staff held their breath, silent, watching, a dozen pairs of eyes frozen on Aaliyah as she took a deliberate step forward, tray still raised, the faint aroma of vanilla and espresso surrounding her like an invisible shield. As she began to speak, voice clear and calm despite the tension, "Sir, if this order is processed as is, the shipment could cause $100,000 loss." And the room held, every muscle taut. The hum of conversation vanished, replaced by the soft tapping of a tablet on the counter as Ethan's assistant tried to verify the numbers, faces shifting in disbelief, whispers trailing off like wind through a narrow alley. Aaliyah continued, pointing to the marked sections on the order, her tone steady, deliberate, every word a precise instrument, slicing through the noise, the aroma of freshly ground beans mingling with the sharp tang of lemon from the display pastries, her eyes meeting Ethan's, unblinking, resolute, and for the first time, the confident facade of the CO wavered, his jaw tightening as he leaned slightly over the counter, scanning the details himself, the sunlight reflecting off the rim of his glasses, catching the tension in his expression, a flicker of curiosity breaking through, a hint of acknowledgement that perhaps he had underestimated the small figure standing before him, the young black waitress who had been quietly perfecting her craft, observing, noting, and now speaking with authority. And the cafe itself seemed to inhale, waiting for the next move. The trays, the cups, the scent of coffee, the soft clatter of silverware all forming a stage for this unassuming yet commanding presence. A clash of social hierarchy and hidden expertise, where respect had yet to be earned but truth refused to be ignored. And as Aaliyah's words hung in the air, the soft chime of the doorbell as a late customer entered, the subtle glint of sunlight on a steel espresso tamper, the faint rustle of napkins on the counter, all became part of the pulse of the room, synchronized with her heartbeat, and with that, the first ripple of recognition passed through Ethan's expression, a silent acknowledgement that the smallest voice sometimes carried the loudest truth, and the cafe held its breath, poised on the edge of revelation, the morning air thick with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. The room stayed suspended in silence, the soft hum of the espresso machine filling the gap where conversation should have been, as Ethan Whitman leaned back slightly, adjusting his cufflinks, the polished metal catching the light, and drawing attention to the precise movements of a man who had always controlled every detail, yet now felt the weight of scrutiny on him. Aaliyah Thompson standing firm with her tray at her side, not a flicker of hesitation in her posture, the warmth of the morning sunlight catching the edges of her dark hair and the gentle shimmer of the stainless steel counter reflecting in her eyes, the scent of roasted coffee beans blending with the faint perfume of fresh pastries creating an almost tangible atmosphere of anticipation. Each customer frozen mid-sip, glances darting between the two, sensing the subtle shift in authority that had occurred without a word more. Aaliyah carefully set the tray down on the counter, fingers brushing against the cool ceramic of the coffee cups, and slowly pointed toward the pile of order sheets, her voice low but clear, steady enough to reach everyone present, explaining line by line the overlooked detail that could have caused a costly error. Ethan followed her gesture, his brows knitting together. As he traced the margins, the rustle of paper the only sound punctuating the thickening tension, and as he flipped through the sheets, his eyes widening slightly. The certainty he carried so easily moments before now wavered, each figure and annotation a silent testament to Aaliyah's keen observation and meticulous memory. She continued, emphasizing the implications with calm precision. The sunlight shifting as it passed through the blinds, casting narrow stripes of light and shadow across the counter, across Aaliyah's face, and across Ethan's expression, revealing the subtle transformations in his demeanor, from irritation to reluctant acknowledgement. The patrons leaning forward, sensing the gravity, the servers behind the counter exchanging quick, quiet glances as they observed how someone they had overlooked was quietly commanding the room with nothing more than knowledge and composure. The aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant city. Sounds seeping through the windows, all elements conspiring to heighten the moment, the seconds stretching longer as Ethan raised his hand slowly to adjust his glasses, his eyes lingering on the careful notes and highlighted sections Aaliyah had pointed out, realizing for the first time that the small, unassuming waitress had anticipated the entire issue, that her presence was not accidental, that her insight was grounded in experience and intellect. And as Aaliyah turned slightly, allowing her gaze to sweep the room, it became clear that she was no longer just a server. She was a silent force, a focal point of authority and reason, every eye following her movements, every ear attuned to her words. And in that charged stillness, the café seemed to collectively recognize the subtle inversion of power, a young black woman calmly correcting the most powerful man in the room, not with volume, but with precision. And as Ethan finally set the sheets down, leaning back and exhaling slowly, a subtle nod forming on his lips, the shift was complete, the first crack in the facade of arrogance and assumption, leaving the room suspended between tension and revelation, aware that the story had only just begun. The tension in the cafe lingered, a quiet hum of anticipation threading through the air as sunlight shifted across the polished counters, catching the edges of Aaliyah Thompson's uniform and the small gleam of her name badge, her hands folded lightly in front of her while Ethan Whitman stood, silently, adjusting his cufflinks with a subtle exhale, eyes narrowing thoughtfully as he processed the implications of her observations. The faint scent of roasted coffee mingling with the lingering aroma of pastries still warm from the oven, creating a sensory backdrop that made every sound and movement in the room more pronounced, the soft clatter of spoons against ceramic cups punctuating the otherwise hushed atmosphere. While patrons and staff alike remained still, the invisible pulse of attention tethered to the unassuming figure who had quietly commanded it. And as Ethan's gaze flickered across the counter, he noticed the meticulous way Aaliyah had highlighted the critical points on the order sheet, her handwriting neat, precise, each number and annotation carrying weight far beyond the paper. And in that moment, a realization settled in, the weight of underestimated expertise pressing gently against his composure, a subtle tremor of recognition in his expression that he had misjudged the small, attentive waitress who had spent countless hours observing, noting, and now illuminating a hidden truth. Aaliyah's posture remained confident, the slight tilt of her chin, the calm steadiness in her eyes conveying a quiet authority, as if the air itself bent to acknowledge her presence, the light filtering through the tall windows casting elongated shadows across the polished floor, accentuating the rhythm of the tension. Each breath measured, each glance exchanged with silent communication, and as Ethan reached for the highlighted sheet, scanning it carefully, the hum of the espresso machine seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat, the soft clink of a cup on a saucer echoing in the pause, emphasizing the gravity of her insight, the cafe itself almost holding its breath in reverent attention, and then the subtle nod of recognition passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that knowledge and diligence, even from the most overlooked corner of the establishment, carried a power that no title or suit could override. And as Aaliyah shifted slightly to return the tray to its place, the gentle scrape of it against the counter resonated with the quiet triumph of unseen competence, the morning sunlight reflecting off the edges of glasses and polished metal, casting a delicate glow on her face, revealing the calm confidence that had held steady through scrutiny and doubt. While Ethan's expression softened, a mixture of respect and surprise, his previous assumptions melting into understanding, the room remaining hushed, every patron and staff member absorbing the subtle reversal that had unfolded before their eyes. The previously unassuming waitress now standing as the pivot of insight and quiet authority, and as she turned toward the espresso machine, adjusting a cup with practiced care, the sense of balance in the room shifted, the invisible thread of command now resting on her shoulders, leaving Ethan momentarily still, eyes tracing her movements. Realizing that recognition and merit could emerge from any place, that quiet observation, careful attention, and courage could command respect even without a title. And in that suspended moment, the café seemed to acknowledge the delicate, potent power of truth and diligence manifest in the smallest of gestures, the air thick with quiet revelation, anticipation lingering like a soft exhale, hinting that the story was only beginning to unfold. The quiet did not break all at once. It shifted, like a slow-turning gear, as Ethan Whitman placed the paper down with deliberate care, his fingers lingering for a fraction longer than necessary, the faint sound of the sheet brushing the polished surface echoing louder than it should have. And for the first time since he had walked in, his posture softened, not in weakness but in recalibration, his shoulders lowering slightly, as if adjusting to a new weight he had not anticipated carrying. While Aaliyah Thompson moved behind the counter with steady precision, reaching for a clean cup, the ceramic cool against her fingertips, the subtle hiss of steam from the espresso machine rising into the air, wrapping around her like a familiar rhythm, grounding her, the scent of dark roast filling the space again as if reclaiming the room from the tension that had just unfolded, and the customers, one by one, began to shift in their seats, not speaking yet, but breathing again, their attention still tethered to the quiet exchange that had altered something unseen but undeniable. Ethan glanced up, his eyes following Aaliyah's movements, noting the efficiency, the calm, the absence of hesitation. The way she wiped a small drop of coffee from the counter with a folded cloth, her motion smooth, practiced, almost meditative, and something about that simplicity unsettled him more than the revelation itself, because it suggested this was not a rare moment for her, not an accident, but a reflection of something deeper, something consistent, something he had overlooked entirely, and his assistant leaned closer, whispering a confirmation under his breath, the numbers checked, the implications real, the potential loss avoided, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier than before, his mind replaying the interaction, the tone he had used, the assumption he had made, the immediate dismissal of someone based solely on appearance and role, and he straightened, adjusting his jacket as if reclaiming composure. But the shift in his eyes remained, a quiet awareness now present where certainty had once dominated, and Aaliyah placed the finished cup on the counter, aligning it perfectly with the saucer, the small clink marking the return of ordinary sound to the room. Yet nothing felt entirely ordinary anymore. The balance had changed, subtly but irreversibly, and as she turned, their eyes met again, not confrontational, not triumphant, just steady, grounded, and for a brief moment, Ethan held that gaze, recognizing the calm confidence that did not demand attention but commanded it. Anyway, and he opened his mouth slightly as if to speak, then paused, the words not forming as easily as they once did, because this moment required something different, something more measured, more honest, and around them, the cafe resumed its rhythm in fragments, a chair scraping lightly against the floor, a spoon stirring in a cup, the low murmur of a conversation restarting in the corner, but all of it felt secondary, like background noise to a shift that had already taken place, and Aaliyah picked up the tray again, her movements fluid, returning to her duties without ceremony, as if what had just happened was simply part of doing the job right, and that, more than anything, stayed with Ethan, the realization that she had not spoken to impress, or to challenge, but because it was necessary, because it was right. And as he watched her walk toward another table, sunlight catching the edge of the tray and reflecting softly across the room, he understood something he had not expected to learn that morning, that authority without awareness was fragile, and that the quietest voice in the room might be the one that sees the most. And as that thought settled in, he reached again for the paper, this time not out of control, but out of respect, knowing this was only the beginning of something he could not yet fully understand. The light shifted slowly across the cafe as mid-morning settled in, filtering through the tall windows in narrow beams that highlighted the dust motes floating lazily in the air, the faint clatter of cups and saucers resuming as the background rhythm, while Aaliyah Thompson moved with deliberate calm behind the counter, her posture straight, eyes attentive, each movement measured and graceful, picking up a small stack of order sheets and aligning them perfectly, the slight rustle of paper carrying more significance than it seemed, as Ethan Whitman observed. Quietly from the corner of the room, the weight of his presence suddenly tempered by reflection, the sharp edge of authority softened by acknowledgement. He adjusted the collar of his navy suit, the fabric warm and familiar, yet his mind stretched into the unfamiliar territory of respect for a quiet yet commanding insight, and Aaliyah's hands moved over the papers, annotating as she spoke softly, her voice carrying clearly through the cafe, precise and calm, outlining the implications of the morning deliveries and pointing to critical errors that had been overlooked, each word deliberate, every gesture purposeful, commanding attention without demanding it, the aroma of roasted coffee mingling with the faint scent of lemon from the pastries on display, creating a sensory anchor for the moment, and Ethan followed her annotations closely, the numbers and details forming a narrative of diligence and accuracy that could not be dismissed, his eyes flickering with surprise, a subtle nod, acknowledging the skill and knowledge presented before him, the other staff glancing at him briefly, sensing the shift in energy, the unspoken lesson settling into the room, a quiet authority emerging from someone long underestimated. And as Aaliyah set the papers down, aligning each sheet with exacting care, the sunlight catching the edge of the stack and reflecting faintly across the counter, she exhaled slowly, a soft sigh that carried neither triumph nor tension, just the acknowledgement of a task executed with integrity, while Ethan remained standing, hands lightly folded in front of him, contemplating the subtle yet undeniable power of preparation, observation, and clear communication. And in that suspended silence, the cafe seemed to pulse with recognition, a rhythm of quiet respect for competence, for foresight, for courage presented calmly and without pretense. The murmurs of patrons resuming softly as they sensed the extraordinary unfolding in an ordinary morning, the clinking of silverware and the soft hiss of the espresso machine punctuating the delicate balance of routine and revelation. And Aaliyah moved again, retrieving a cup for a new customer with effortless grace, her presence both unobtrusive and commanding, the gentle tilt of her head, the focused glint in her eyes, all elements signaling competence and calm authority, while Ethan's gaze remained fixed, the recognition deepening, a subtle shift in understanding, a realization that the smallest gestures can carry immense weight, that diligence and honesty cannot be ignored, and that respect, once earned through demonstrated skill and quiet confidence, reshapes perception and interaction in ways words alone cannot convey. The morning continuing around them, but within the sphere of their interaction, a transformative awareness had settled, quiet yet resolute, an understanding that power and insight are not defined by titles, and that sometimes the simplest observation, the calmest voice, and the most meticulous attention to detail can alter the trajectory of a day, a meeting, and perhaps even a person's perspective, leaving the air charged with a subtle anticipation of what might follow next. The hum of the cafe seemed to settle into a new rhythm, each footstep on the hardwood floor and the soft scrape of chairs carrying a weight that was both ordinary and charged with subtle anticipation. As Aaliyah Thompson moved deliberately to refill a carafe of freshly brewed coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the morning light, the warmth rising gently into the air and mingling with the faint sweetness of pastries cooling on the display shelves, her fingers brushing the smooth metal handle. With practiced ease while her eyes remained vigilant, scanning the cafe for any overlooked details, for any signs that another issue might arise before it could grow into a problem, and Ethan Whitman remained seated, his hands folded lightly on the polished table, the sunlight reflecting faintly off the silver rim of his watch, catching the slight tension in his jaw and the subtle shift in his expression as he considered the unassuming figure moving with quiet confidence in front of him, every motion measured, every glance purposeful, and the murmurs of the patrons slowly resumed, each voice a soft layer of background sound, punctuating the subtle power dynamic that had shifted without fanfare. And Aaliyah carefully poured the coffee into a waiting cup, the rich aroma wrapping around her like a cloak of familiarity, grounding her in the precise control of the moment, while Ethan observed, silently, his gaze following the smooth tilt of the carafe, the gentle clink of porcelain against the counter, noting how her small actions carried clarity and authority, how the confidence in her posture and voice seemed to ripple outward, touching everyone in the room, the staff glancing briefly at him, sensing a change, the subtle realization that someone they had overlooked held insight that could not be ignored. And Aaliyah moved again, aligning a tray of cups with exacting care, the faint reflection of sunlight catching the edges, her focus unwavering, the soft scent of roasted beans and vanilla still hanging in the air, reinforcing the sense of presence and attention, while Ethan's thoughts raced quietly, noting the precision and calm, the way she anticipated every possible outcome and prepared for it, her quiet diligence asserting itself as a form of authority that required no demand, no declaration, just execution. And as she turned slightly to attend to another customer, the room seemed to collectively inhale, the patrons, the staff, and even Ethan himself absorbing the subtle yet unmistakable influence she carried, the balance of attention and control shifting imperceptibly, yet definitively, and Ethan's posture relaxed marginally, a soft acknowledgement forming in the set of his shoulders and the thoughtful line of his mouth. Realizing the depth of care and competence in someone he had previously underestimated, the air thick with the quiet reverberation of respect earned through observation, skill, and courage, and Aaliyah, unaware of the internal calculations around her, continued her work with calm precision, each motion deliberate, each glance assessing, and the cafe carried on, but every element, the sound of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, the shifting sunlight, the soft rustle of napkins, echoed the new equilibrium. The unspoken recognition that authority could emerge from attentiveness, diligence, and integrity, a lesson unfolding, quietly but unmistakably, leaving Ethan Whitman contemplating what it meant to truly see someone, to acknowledge capability beyond appearances. And as Aaliyah moved past, returning a smile to a customer, the atmosphere held a fragile yet potent tension, a sense that the morning had transformed, subtly, irrevocably, into something richer and more aware than it had been, and that understanding hung in the air like a gentle, unspoken truth. The balance in the cafe felt steady for only a moment before it shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as a new voice cut through the softened atmosphere, sharp and impatient, breaking the fragile calm that had settled over the room. A man in a tailored gray suit stepping forward from a nearby table, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with deliberate authority, his eyes flicking between Ethan Whitman and the neatly stacked order sheets, his tone measured but edged with urgency as he spoke about delivery timelines and contractual obligations. And the tension, once diffused, began to coil again, threading through the air like an invisible current, the faint hum of the espresso machine rising in contrast to the tightening silence. While Aaliyah Thompson paused mid-motion, her hand hovering over a cup, sensing the shift before it fully formed, her eyes lifting calmly to observe the exchange, the subtle narrowing of her gaze reflecting focus rather than concern, and Ethan straightened slightly, the familiar posture of control returning to his frame, his shoulders squaring, his voice lowering as he addressed the man. But the confidence was no longer absolute. It carried a careful edge now, as if weighed against the realization that the details he had nearly overlooked were still unfolding, and the man gestured toward the documents, pointing out a discrepancy in delivery timing that had not yet been addressed, his finger tapping lightly against the paper, each tap echoing softly through the cafe like a countdown. The patrons falling quiet once more, sensing the escalation there. Conversations trailing off into silence, and Aaliyah stepped closer without hesitation, her movements smooth, unhurried, placing the cup down gently before reaching for the documents again, her fingers brushing the paper with familiarity, her eyes scanning quickly, the numbers and notes aligning in her mind with practiced clarity, and she spoke again, her voice steady, grounded, cutting through the rising tension with quiet precision, explaining how the timing discrepancy was linked to the same oversight she had identified earlier, her tone calm yet firm, each word deliberate, and the man's expression shifted, his certainty faltering for a brief moment as he listened, the sharpness in his posture easing slightly as the logic of her explanation settled in, and Ethan watched closely, his gaze moving between the two, absorbing not just the information but the dynamic, the way Aaliyah held the space with composure, how she navigated the complexity without raising her voice, how she maintained clarity while others leaned into urgency, and the room seemed to hold its breath again, the soft clink of a spoon against a cup marking the only interruption, as Aaliyah finished her explanation and stepped back, her posture unchanged, her presence calm, and the man in the gray suit exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as he reconsidered his stance, the tension easing from his expression as understanding replaced doubt, and Ethan gave a slight nod, not just in agreement but in acknowledgement, a quiet signal that the authority in the room was no longer defined solely by position or title, but by clarity and truth, and as the man stepped back, adjusting his jacket, the energy shifted once more, not into silence this time, but into something steadier, more grounded, a shared recognition of competence that did not need to be announced, and Aaliyah returned to her position behind the counter, her movements fluid, unremarkable to anyone who had not witnessed the exchange, yet undeniable in their impact, and as the cafe resumed its rhythm, the light filtering through the windows casting soft reflections across the room, Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his eyes following Aaliyah as she moved, the realization settling deeper, that this was not a single moment of insight, but a pattern, a consistency, a truth that had been present all along, waiting to be seen, and as he reached again for the documents, his grip gentler now. The understanding that formed was quiet but firm, that what he had witnessed was not just competence, but integrity in motion, and that realization carried more weight than any contract ever could. The cafe no longer felt like a place of routine. It felt like a space holding its breath between moments, as if every surface, every cup, every reflection of light had become aware of the quiet shift that had taken root, and Aaliyah Thompson moved through it with the same calm precision, her hands steady as she wiped down the counter, the faint scent of citrus cleaner rising briefly before dissolving into the richer aroma of espresso, her eyes scanning not just for tasks but for patterns, for anything that did not align. While Ethan Whitman remained near the table, no longer at its center but slightly to the side, his presence altered, his posture less rigid, his gaze thoughtful as it followed her movements, and for the first time, he did not interrupt the silence. He let it exist, let it stretch, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside filling the gaps where his voice once dominated, and then, almost without realizing it, he spoke, his tone quieter, measured, lacking the sharp edge it carried earlier, asking a question not to challenge but to understand, his eyes returning to the documents in his hand as he referenced a clause, his voice trailing slightly at the end as if leaving space for correction, and Aaliyah paused, the cloth in her hand still, her head tilting slightly as she listened, her attention fully present, and when she responded, her voice carried that same calm clarity, explaining not just the surface issue, but the underlying structure, how one overlooked detail connected to another, how the timing, the numbers, and the delivery terms all formed a chain that either held or broke depending on precision. And the way she spoke did not demand authority, it revealed it, layer by layer, like light gradually illuminating a dark room, and Ethan listened, truly listened, his eyes moving between her and the page, his mind adjusting, recalibrating, the faint crease in his brow no longer from frustration but from concentration, and around them, the cafe resumed its quiet rhythm, but it was different now, more aware, the staff moving with a subtle attentiveness, the customers glancing over not out of curiosity but out of recognition that something meaningful was unfolding in the most ordinary of settings, and Aaliyah finished her explanation with a small nod, not expecting acknowledgement, simply completing the thought, and turned slightly to continue her work, but Ethan stopped her, not with force, but with a simple, quiet word, and when she looked back, There was a pause, a moment where the air seemed to still again, and he spoke with a tone that carried something new, something unfamiliar. A question that did not come from authority but from curiosity, asking how she had seen it so quickly, how she had understood what others had missed, and Aaliyah's expression did not change much, but there was a slight shift in her eyes, a softness, a reflection of something deeper, and she answered simply, explaining that when you spend enough time paying attention, you start to notice what others overlook, that details speak if you listen long enough, and her words settled into the space between them, quiet but profound, and Ethan absorbed them, not as a challenge, but as a truth, his gaze lowering briefly to the page before lifting again, the recognition deepening, and in that moment, the power dynamic that had once defined the room dissolved even further, replaced by something more balanced, more human, a shared understanding that insight was not tied to position, that clarity could come from anywhere. And as Aaliyah turned back to her work, the soft clink of a cup, meeting its saucer marking the continuation of the day, Ethan remained still for a moment longer, holding the weight of what he had just learned, the realization not loud or dramatic, but quiet, steady, and undeniable, like the slow rise of morning light that changes everything without asking for attention. The cafe had settled into a quieter rhythm, but beneath it, something unspoken continued to build, like a current running just below still water, as Aaliyah Thompson stood at the register reviewing a fresh printout that had just arrived from the back office. The paper still warm, edges slightly curled, the faint scent of ink mixing with the ever-present aroma of coffee, her eyes scanning the figures with the same careful precision, her fingers lightly tapping the corner of the page as if aligning her thoughts with what she was seeing, while Ethan Whitman watched from a few feet away, no longer distant, no longer detached, his attention fully anchored to her movements, his posture relaxed yet alert, as if he had begun to understand that something important revealed itself in these quiet details, and the low murmur of customers filled the background, punctuated by the soft hiss of milk steaming and the occasional clink of glassware, creating a steady rhythm that framed the moment, without distracting from it. And then Aaliyah's expression shifted, not dramatically, but just enough, a subtle tightening around her eyes, a slight pause in her breathing, the kind of change only someone paying close attention would notice, and she looked again, slower this time, tracing a line with her fingertip across the numbers, her mind connecting pieces that did not align, and without hesitation, she turned slightly, her voice calm but carrying a new weight, calling out a quiet clarification about a supplier code that had been entered incorrectly, her tone not urgent but firm, grounded in certainty, and the manager behind the counter hesitated, glancing at the system, typing quickly, the soft clicking of keys echoing louder than usual as confirmation began to appear on the screen, and Ethan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, following the exchange, sensing the shift before it was fully spoken. And as the manager's expression changed from routine focus to mild concern, the air in the cafe tightened again, the background noise softening as if the room itself was listening, and Aaliyah explained further, her voice steady, outlining how the incorrect code would redirect an entire shipment to the wrong distribution center, causing delays, losses, and confusion that would ripple outward beyond the cafe itself. Her words precise, each one landing with quiet authority, and Ethan felt it then, the deeper layer beneath everything that had happened so far. This was not just about one mistake, one correction. This was a pattern of awareness, a level of attention that operated beyond the surface, and the realization settled into him with a quiet intensity. As he reached for the paper, his fingers brushing against hers for a brief second, the contact light, but grounding, and he scanned the figures himself, seeing now what he would have missed before, the subtle discrepancy that could have easily slipped through unnoticed, and the manager confirmed it moments later, the system displaying the error in clear terms. And a quiet ripple moved through the staff, not panic, not chaos, but recognition, the kind that comes when something serious has been avoided just in time. And Aaliyah exhaled softly, not in relief, but in completion, as if she had simply done what needed to be done, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unchanged, and she returned the paper to the counter, aligning it neatly with the others, while Ethan stood still for a moment longer, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. The second time in a single morning that her attention had prevented something significant, and this time, the realization went deeper. It was not just respect forming. It was something closer to accountability, a quiet acknowledgement that he had walked into this place assuming he understood everything. And yet, without her, he would have missed it all. And as Aaliyah turned to assist another customer, her voice softening again into its usual warmth, the cafe resumed its flow. But Ethan remained there, holding the paper, the numbers. No longer just data, but proof. And in that stillness, the truth settled fully into place, undeniable, unshakable, that the person he had overlooked at the beginning of the morning was the one holding everything together, not loudly, not visibly, but with a quiet precision that made all the difference. The realization did not arrive with noise or urgency. It settled slowly, like the quiet weight of something undeniable, as Ethan Whitman stood with the paper still in his hand, the edges slightly bent from his grip, the numbers no longer abstract figures but evidence of what had almost been lost, and more importantly, of who had prevented it, and the cafe moved around him in its steady rhythm. The soft hiss of milk steaming, the low murmur of conversations returning, the faint chime of the door, opening and closing, all continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet for Ethan, everything had shifted, his gaze lifting from the page to find Aaliyah Thompson again, her figure moving between tables with the same calm efficiency, offering a cup here, adjusting a plate there, her voice gentle, attentive, as if the weight of the morning had not touched her at all, and that contrast stayed with him, the quiet consistency, the absence of self-importance, the way she returned to her work without pause, without seeking acknowledgement. And he took a slow breath, his shoulders easing as he stepped forward, the sound of his shoes against the floor softer now, less commanding, more deliberate, as he approached the counter where she stood organizing a new set of receipts, her fingers aligning the edges with practiced precision, the faint scent of paper and ink rising briefly before fading into the warmth of the room. And for a moment, he did not speak, he simply stood there, allowing the space to exist without interruption, the light from the window casting a soft glow across the counter, reflecting off the polished surface and onto both of them. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different tone, quieter, measured, lacking the sharp edge that had defined it earlier, and he acknowledged what she had done, not in grand terms, not in exaggerated praise, but in a simple, direct statement that carried sincerity, recognizing the impact of her attention, the clarity of her thinking, the way she had seen what others had missed. And Aaliyah paused, her hands resting lightly on the counter, her eyes lifting to meet his, her expression steady, unchanged, as if she had not been waiting for this moment, as if she had already moved past it, and she responded with a small nod, her voice calm, almost understated, explaining that she had only done what was necessary, that the details were there for anyone willing to look closely enough. And her words did not diminish the moment, they deepened it, because they carried no need for validation, no desire to elevate herself, only a quiet commitment to doing things right. And Ethan absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the honesty, and for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar in this setting, not authority, not control, but respect that was earned, not assumed. And he glanced briefly at the surrounding staff, noticing the subtle way they now looked at Aaliyah, the shift in their expressions, the quiet acknowledgement that had taken root, and he realized that the change was not his alone. It had spread, quietly, naturally, through observation and example. And he looked back at her, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer imposing but present, grounded. And in that moment, the distance that had existed between them at the start of the morning dissolved completely, replaced by something simpler, more human, an understanding that value does not announce itself. It reveals itself through action, through consistency, through truth. And as Aaliyah returned to her work, lifting the tray once more, the soft clink of cups marking the continuation of the day, Ethan remained still for a second longer, letting the realization settle fully, knowing that what had shifted inside him would not fade with the passing hours, that it would stay, shaping how he saw not just this moment, but the ones that would follow. And as he finally turned back toward the table, the paper still in his hand, It no longer felt like a document to control, but a reminder of something far more important, something he had nearly missed and would not overlook again. The cafe carried on with its quiet rhythm, but for Ethan Whitman, the morning no longer felt ordinary. It felt like a moment suspended between who he had been and who he was becoming. As he stood near the window, the soft light outlining the edge of his figure, his reflection, faintly visible in the glass, layered over the movement of the street outside, and he watched Aaliyah Thompson again, not as someone in the background, not as a role defined by uniform or position, but as a presence, steady and grounded, her movements precise, her attention unwavering, and something in him shifted deeper, more personal, a quiet discomfort settling in as he replayed his own voice from earlier, the sharpness, the dismissal, the ease with which he had reduced her to something small without knowing anything about her at all. And that realization lingered, heavier than any mistake on paper, because this one had not been about numbers. It had been about perception, about judgment, about the assumptions he carried without question, and he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him longer than he expected, as if releasing something he had not known he was holding. While across the room, Aaliyah handed a cup to a customer, her voice soft, polite, the small exchange filled with the same quiet care she had shown all morning, no difference in tone, no shift in attitude, as if every interaction mattered equally. And that consistency struck him again, the absence of ego, the focus on doing what was right regardless of who was watching. And he stepped away from the window, his pace slower now, more intentional, each step measured not by urgency, but by thought. And as he approached the counter once more, the sound of his shoes seemed less pronounced, less commanding, blending into the ambient noise of the cafe rather than cutting through it. And when he reached her, he did not immediately speak. He waited, allowing her to finish what she was doing, watching the way she carefully placed a receipt into a small holder, aligning it with the others, her attention to detail present in even the smallest action. And when she finally looked up, meeting his gaze, there was no tension there, no expectation, just a calm awareness. And he spoke then, not as a CEO, not as someone issuing direction, but as a person acknowledging another, his voice steady, honest, carrying a weight that came from reflection rather than authority. And he apologized, not in a rushed or performative way, but clearly, directly, acknowledging the way he had spoken earlier, the assumptions he had made, the respect he had failed to show, and the words hung in the air for a moment, quiet but significant, and the cafe seemed to soften around them, the background noise continuing but no longer pressing in, as if the space itself allowed room for something more human to unfold. And Aaliyah listened, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and when she responded, her voice was calm, grounded, not dismissive, not overly accepting, simply acknowledging what had been said. And she gave a small nod, not making the moment larger than it needed to be, not holding on to what had passed, just allowing it to exist, and then move forward. And that, more than anything, stayed with Ethan. The simplicity of it, the lack of bitterness, the quiet strength it took to stand firm, to speak truth, and then to let go without carrying resentment. And he felt something settle in him then, not just respect, but a deeper understanding. That strength did not always look like control or command. Sometimes it looked like clarity, like patience, like the ability to see what others missed and still choose to act with integrity. And as Aaliyah returned to her work, lifting a tray and moving toward another table, the light catching the edge of the cups and reflecting softly across the room, Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, the apology no longer just words, but a turning point, a quiet decision to see differently, to listen more closely, and to remember that the most important truths are often spoken by those the world is too quick to overlook. The cafe no longer felt divided by roles or titles. It felt connected by something quieter, something steadier, as the late morning light stretched further across the floor, warming the edges of tables and catching the soft movement of people settling into their routines. And Aaliyah Thompson moved through it all with the same calm rhythm, her steps light, her attention precise, her presence no longer overlooked but quietly recognized. The subtle glances from staff and customers carrying a new awareness, a silent respect that had not been there before, and Ethan Whitman stood near the counter again, not as an observer this time, but as someone learning to exist within the space rather than above it. His posture relaxed, his gaze thoughtful, the earlier tension replaced by a steady clarity, and as he reviewed the corrected documents one more time, his fingers tracing the lines more carefully now, not out of control but out of understanding, he realized how much had changed in just a few hours, not in the cafe itself, but in the way he saw it, in the way he saw the people within it. And Aaliyah approached quietly, placing a fresh cup of coffee near him without interruption. The soft clink of ceramic meeting would marking a simple gesture, yet it carried a different weight now. And he looked up, meeting her eyes again, this time without hesitation, without distance. And there was a moment of stillness between them, not tense, not uncertain, but grounded, as if both understood the shift that had taken place without needing to name it. And he spoke again, his voice steady, not to question or correct, but to acknowledge something deeper, asking how long she had been working there, not out of curiosity alone, but out of genuine interest. And Aaliyah answered simply, explaining that it had been some time, her tone calm, her expression unchanged. And when he asked how she had developed such attention to detail, there was a brief pause, her gaze lowering slightly before returning to his, and she explained that paying attention had always mattered, that when you grow up learning that small mistakes can cost you more than just inconvenience, you learn to notice things others ignore. Her words quiet but layered, carrying more meaning than they revealed on the surface. And Ethan listened, really listened, the weight of her experience settling into him, reshaping his understanding even further. And he nodded slowly, not offering a response immediately, allowing her words to exist without interruption. And around them, the cafe continued its steady rhythm, the low murmur of conversation, the soft hiss of steam, the gentle clatter of cups, all forming a backdrop that no longer felt ordinary, but intentional, as if every sound, every movement contributed to the quiet lesson unfolding within the space. And Aaliyah turned to continue her work, lifting a tray with practiced ease, her posture steady, her focus unwavering. And Ethan watched her go, not with curiosity now, but with recognition, the kind that stays, the kind that changes how you move forward. And he glanced down at the documents one last time before setting them aside, no longer needing to check them again, because the trust had already been established, not through authority, but through consistency, through truth, and through the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything to offer. And as the sunlight shifted once more, casting a warmer glow across the room, the cafe felt different, not because anything visible had changed, but because the people within it had. The assumptions loosened, the awareness deepened, and in that quiet transformation, something lasting had taken root, something that would remain. Long after the morning had passed, the cafe settled into a gentle afternoon calm, the light now warmer, softer, stretching across the floor in long golden lines that touched every table, every cup, every quiet corner. And Aaliyah Thompson moved through it with the same steady rhythm, her presence blending seamlessly into the space, yet leaving a trace of something deeper, something felt rather than seen, as she placed a final cup on a table near the window, her fingers releasing it with care, the soft clink marking a simple ending to a task done right. And across the room, Ethan Whitman stood near the door, his jacket draped over his arm, the weight of the morning still present in his posture, but no longer heavy, no longer rigid, instead something quieter, more grounded, as if the edges of his perspective had been softened, reshaped by something he had not expected to find. And he paused before leaving, his gaze drifting once more toward Aaliyah, watching the way she adjusted a chair slightly to align it with the table, the way she glanced at the counter to ensure everything was in place, small actions, almost invisible, yet filled with intention. And for a moment, the world outside the cafe, the meetings, the contracts, the constant movement of decisions and consequences, felt distant, muted, as if this space had created a pause he did not know he needed. And he stepped closer, not to interrupt, not to command, but simply to stand within that understanding one last time. And when Aaliyah noticed him, her expression remained calm, open, the same quiet confidence that had carried her through the entire morning. And he gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, just a simple acknowledgement, one person to another. and she returned it just as simply, no more, no less. And in that exchange, there was no hierarchy, no distance, just recognition, and Ethan turned then. Pushing the door open, the soft chime echoing gently as sunlight from outside spilled in, brighter, harsher than the warm glow within, and he stepped out into it, the noise of the street rising to meet him, the movement, the urgency, all waiting. But something in him remained anchored to the quiet clarity he had just experienced, and inside, Aaliyah continued her work, the rhythm unchanged, the focus steady, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, and yet everything had, not in the way the world measures importance, but in the way a single moment can shift how one person sees another, how one truth can dissolve 100 assumptions, and the cafe held that truth in its stillness, in the faint aroma of coffee that lingered even as the day moved forward, in the soft light that now began to fade toward evening, and somewhere between the clink of cups and the quiet footsteps across the floor, the meaning settled, not spoken, not announced, but present, steady and real, that dignity does not ask for permission, that truth does not need a title, and that sometimes the person the world overlooks is the one who sees it most clearly. And as the door closed gently behind the last wave of sunlight, the space returned to its calm, carrying with it a quiet reminder that would not fade, not for Ethan, not for anyone who had been there, that respect is not given by status. It is earned by how you show up when no one is looking, and that was enough.